Good afternoon, and I hope you're all working hard at home. We're going to do some work here today on civil rights in the United States. We finished off the moon landing in lessons recently. The third part of your USA course is civil rights in the United States. It'll be the third document question that could come up in the Leaving Cert. Okay. Before we start, I'm going to give you a few pointers to what's maybe out there program-wise that you could be watching. Okay, if you're working hard and you finish work as a little reward to yourself. So we've got, first of all, CNN, the Cold War, episode 6 deals with McCarthyism, which we done at the Houses of the One American Activity Committee. That period, 1947 to 1953, post-war America, the Red Threat and all that sort of thing, okay? So that's one of the things you could watch. This is a big series now, if you want to take this on. It's called it's a 10-episode production, and they've divided it up into different ones, going from really the Mercury space program at the start, through the Gemini space program, through to the Apollo space program, and they've done it in a drama form. Each episode is quite self-contained, and it's okay. I mean, it's quite good. It's very American, as you'd imagine, but it's quite good. So there's great shots of the moon, and so that's another one. And of course, then if you wanted something a little bit more documentary, historical, if you like, the Vietnam War, another 10-episode challenge, great footage, good commentary by a guy called Ken Burns. Okay, he's an American documentary filmmaker. He's made one called The Civil War. He's made one called The History of Jazz, if you're interested in that. And he works for PBS America. That's the which I know is on your Sky channels. If you've got Sky, it's PBS is on there. It's probably on other areas as well. So they're the three series there. If we look at another one, maybe a few films that you could watch if you're interested in this sort of thing. Okay, we could have Doctor Strange. It's in black and white, and it's made by the very famous film director Stanley Kubrick. Dr. Strangelove. It's a Cold War satire, comedy, satirical comedy. Okay, we give you another one there, which was just in the cinema recently. I'm trying to remember the name. It was up for the Oscars, and it was called, let me come back to that one as well. This is another one, Life is Beautiful. Life is Beautiful. This is in Italian, with Italian subtitles. It's also a sort of, starts off as a romantic comedy, but then gets into fascism in Italy in the 1930s, and the persecution of Jews. And it's quite a tragic film, actually. The guy won an Oscar for it. The other one that I was thinking of is quite an old one here. Schindler's List. You might have seen that long film. The other two, these are focusing on, this is an East German film, and this is a comedy. it's about the fall of the wall in Berlin in '89, and a man has to protect his mother from the fall of the wall. She's a committed socialist. He has to pretend when she went to hospital and came back, then the wall has come down. It happened quickly, of course, and he's trying to pretend that it didn't come down. So he tries to set up various scenarios to convince his mother that the wall is still there. It's called Goodbye Lenin, and of course this one is Lies of Others, and it's come back to me now. The recent film, of course, Joe Rabbit. That's what I was talking about. Could have won the Oscar. Should have won the Oscar, maybe. Okay, so they would keep you entertained, and of course there's a reasonable historical context there. Of course, and then of course you could get into the idea of using film as a historical source. How useful is film as a historical source? And there is one more I can give you, and it's called, and this is quite an old film in terms of, I don't know if, sorry, The Long Walk Home. I think it was made in the 80s or 90s. It was based on Rosa Parks and Montgomery Bus Boycott, which we're going to be talking about in these lessons. Okay, so that's something that can keep you entertained for a while and of use. If you're watching the episodes, of course, you should get out your notes and make notes on these things, because particularly these will give you a real good insight into Vietnam War, for example, and the fall of President Johnson and all that sort of thing that you're doing for your documents-based question. Okay, so we will move on now and we will look at civil rights in the United States. And we will begin with some background. Okay, we will begin with some background, and we will begin with the slave trade. Okay, the slave trade. Let me just get rid of that. Now, as you can see from the map, we've got what we call the Americas here, and Africa and Europe. Okay, now, in the 18th century, we really had the growth of America, and the United States was called the British colonies at that particular time. We had this colonization of America, if you like, a very empty land, and the bringing of agriculture to America, and the enormous space of these two continents. The Spanish down here, of course, the Portuguese here, the Spanish here, even if we go to places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, they're Spanish names. And then of course we have the English coming in here with the 13 colonies, which become known as the United States. And in 1776, they broke away. One of the attractions, they broke away from Britain and formed the United States of America, which you know about, declared in 1776, became an actuality by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and we have then the subsequent immigration from Europe, and the big attraction of these areas was land, and the economy was based on agriculture, and the big products, especially in these southern areas here of the United States, was land, tobacco and cotton. Okay, hugely in demand in Europe. So, how the slave trade worked was, at this stage, slave traders would set off from Britain. Look at the pointing at Ireland. Ireland's a strange shape on that map, isn't it? Okay, they'd set off from Britain with guns, alcohol products, maybe rum was a big one, textiles, clothes, all sorts of things that which were technically superior, and they go to Africa, West Africa, all along here, okay, and they exploited the tribal divisions there. They would trade guns for people. They trade guns for people, okay, and the people then would be slaves. And the slaves then get on ships, and they go here to the West Indies, and then up here to the southern states of the United States. This practice slavery had been on and off in European history, in world history for quite a long time. But you had the large movements of Afro-American people to the United States, and of course slavery was perfect for the tobacco and the cotton industry of the big plantations here in the south. That was the southern rural economy, and of course the ship wasn't ever empty. After they sold the slaves here for a considerable price, they would fill up on cotton and tobacco and return to England, you see. And it wasn't just England, of course, that was involved here. That triangular voyage, one voyage, they estimate, you could retire maybe after one voyage because it was so lucrative, slave trade. And there were vested interest bonds, and it was legal, not illegal, legal until the 18th century. And then the late 1700s, countries began to ban it. By the early 19th century, it was banned. It was banned in all the countries. Slavery was banned within the country, and then the slave trade was banned also. Okay? But by that stage, slavery had been firmly established here in the southern states of the United States as an economic system. And it maintained that sort of thing. They didn't have slavery so much in the northern parts of the United States because the economy was different. It was a free market industrial economy, particularly after an event called the Civil War, which I'll come back and talk to you about. The Civil War, of course, America then looks forward and begins to become this industrial power, developing its primary industries of mining, like coal mining. Oil begins to start playing a part. You have metals, you have all this sort of thing. And then, of course, the secondary industry of manufacturing. And they liked free trade. They liked free trade, and became a very big industrial power. And on the eve of the First World War in 1914, we have the Americans surpassing the strong European economies in terms of production. So America is becoming, United States, I mean, when I say America, I mean United States for future reference, okay? Surpassing the strong economies of France, Belgium, Britain, of course, and Germany, those big strong economies. And yes, so we have the system there, and then of course the trade has been stopped now. The slave trade has been stopped now, but slavery still exists. And in slavery, there was a definite colour line in the South. At the eve of the Civil War, about 1860, let's say 1861, okay, there was meant to be 9 million people in the South, in the southern states, and I'll put up the southern states and then show you where they were and all that sort of thing. About 4 million of them were supposed to be slaves. Now those numbers could be a little bit wrong. So you talk about 5 million white, 4 million black slaves in the South, owned as property. You could buy and sell a slave at the market, still within the United States. Okay, you could buy and sell a slave. You could sell them at the market. You could sell the family. Slaves made up the majority of agricultural work, the majority of domestic servants. Okay, they were owned as property, bought and sold, and it was a really old-fashioned institution because Europe had got rid of it, Russia had got rid of it. It was gone nearly everywhere in the world, except here in the United States, in the South. Okay, and of course any threat to chain slavery, of which there wasn't a huge amount now, to be honest with you. Okay, there were humanitarian groups trying to abolish slavery, but it wasn't really under threat until the period of the Civil War. So that's our slave trade. That's how the situation began. Okay, so we've got lots of immigrant groups coming into America, and of course if they get involved in these large plantations, now we're talking about large plantations, we're talking about farms of thousands of acres. Huge farms, huge plantations, and that's it. Okay, so that's our first map. And if we skip on here to the United States, it started with the 13 states here in the east, and then it began to expand over time. Okay, it began to expand over time. So, for example, the 13 states then expanded up here to the big river. The big river, the Mississippi River, that runs through the United States as a sort of a division. See that line there? That's more or less the river. Okay? And of course, settlements began to build up in the river. And then the United States, they bought this whole central area here, bought it off Napoleon in the year 1803. Napoleon, who was busy fighting everybody he could find to fight, sold this to the American government. The Louisiana Purchase was called. Texas joined after a war, 1846, so did New Mexico, and of course then people were very interested in getting over here, and they got over there. It was an arduous journey. You could be attacked, and you could have to face the various hostile weather and landscape. These were wagon trains that went across here. They were eager to get across here, to California, with this beautiful climate, okay, where it's in the 20s degrees every day, apparently, and it's a beautiful sunny climate. People want to get over here, but they really want to get over here for gold. Gold. In 1848, this became part of the United States. There was a deal done with Britain whereby this part, they did a swap of some land. They bought another piece of the United States called Alaska in 1867 of the Russian government, and so we ended up with 50 states, which makes up the United States today. Okay, this sort of brownie colour, tan, whatever you want to call it, we call this the South, and we call this the Deep South. Okay, and this area here, the South, so important in our politics course at the moment. This is where Joe Biden, if you're following this, was winning all his Democratic votes. This is the area where they think they can defeat Donald Trump. Okay, the South. Okay, so this area, the South, this is where the slavery existed, and these northern states, they were the free marketers, free marketeers. Okay, and of course, as time went on, they began to grow, and there was a debate on how the United States would develop economically. Would it be a free trade industrial power, or would it be a protected agricultural power? Now, the southern products of cotton and tobacco were in huge demand in Europe. Still, people wanted them, as well as northern goods. So these tensions, political tensions, in this enormous country, well, they began to surface in the 1840s and the 1850s and into the 1860s. And in the 1860s then, the president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected. And Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, which I think is this one here, yes? He was from Illinois, and he got elected. He became the president of the United States, and the Southerners, because they were against Lincoln and his Republican policies, the Southerners decided to break away and form a group called the Confederacy. And they made up of these states here: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, I think that's Tennessee, yeah, Arkansas, Florida, Carolinas. Okay, they formed this confederacy, and they broke away. And of course, what the subsequent war that followed, 1861 to 65, was the North called the Union, and the South called the Confederacy. And we have this civil war that happened, and it was on a massive scale, you know, the Civil War, and it was quite a close thing actually. The Confederacy nearly won a few times, but they didn't win, they lost. And of course, halfway through the war, Lincoln pulled a masterstroke. He emancipated the decree for the emancipation of slavery. He abolished slavery. He abolished slavery. He said, if the Union wins the war, we're going to abolish slavery throughout the United States. And of course, this was a big, big moment, of course. Now we have black troops fighting for the Union. And it was a masterstroke because, as well, all support for the South, outside the South, from the European countries of Britain and France, it began to decline pretty quickly because, of course, who's going to support slavery? They loved the cotton, they loved the tobacco, but the public didn't like slavery, and so the North won the war. The North won the war in 1865, and the slaves were free. And that's very, very important moment, right? This liberty, this emancipation of the slaves. Our next period of history really looks at the idea of how the Southerners, the Southern white establishment, the gentry in the South, the old planters, managed to deprive the black people of the South of their liberty in a system that became known as the Jim Crow system. Okay? Now, the explanation for this, of course, is in the federal nature of this country. The federal nature of the country, and we're going to get a little bit technical here and a little bit political. The United States is a federation of 50 states, a union of 50 states, the United States of America. So 50 states in the union. They have a federal government here in Washington, Washington, D.C. That's the federal government. The president is elected by the states. Each state votes for the president. Okay? And sometimes you get an unlikely result, like in 2016. So he's the federal president. But we also have state parliaments and state governors. So the law in the United States, federal law, federal rights and federal power as opposed to state power is a huge thing in the United States. For example, what power does the federal government have over the state of Texas, let's say, for example? Texas has the death penalty. The federal government can't change that, the death penalty. Do you see? Because of the federal system. So this clash between the rights of states and the rights of the federation, the federal government, is a long-running issue in United States politics. It's still there. The rights is, and of course, you have that tension. If we had the same sort of tension here in Europe when we talk about the rights of the individual countries as opposed to the union, when we talked about supranational, do you remember? When the states joined the European Union, they gave up some of their powers to the federal system. The same here. So, what rights do DC have over the states of the South? And of course, in the initial period after the defeat of the South in the Civil War, these groups here, these political groups here, white political groups, tried to reassert their authority by controlling the political mechanism. Right? Now you'll know this from the fact that if you take away people's political voice, they don't have any power. So for example, if we look at women in history, if we look at women before the beginning of the 20th century, it's virtually second-class citizens because there's no vote. And movements like the suffragette to try and get women to vote. After women get the vote in 1918, and subsequently the vote is made the same as men in 1928, we have this system whereby women start entering politics, women start getting elected into jobs, you see? So the disenfranchisement of a group of people removes their power. This was the intention. After the shock of losing the war, the South, the Southerners began to think, how are we going to make the system so that the black people in the South, a considerable amount of people in the South, the black people, how are we going to set up an oppressive system to control those people? Okay. The system they could come up with was Jim Crow, and it was based on three things. First thing was based on control of the political system. And I'm going to explain how you do that. And that's a system called discrimination. So there was discrimination in terms of voting. In other words, if the blacks were now free and entitled to vote, how do you introduce laws to stop people voting? Well, they did it state by state because of the federal nature of the country. So although under the Constitution of the United States everybody is born equal, they managed to think up systems where they could deprive black people of the vote. Okay? The second system that they set up was a system of segregation. And segregation meant that there was going to be separate facilities for blacks and whites in these southern states. Alright? And the third system that they set up was one called intimidation. And this was set up straight away in 1865. In 1866, the year after the Civil War, the South was crawling with what they called Yankee troops, okay, the Union troops. And the Union troops, there was no governments in the South at this stage. The Union troops were all over the South to keep the blacks in place. A terrorist organisation, or an extra-parliamentary organisation, a violent organisation called the Ku Klux Klan was founded, wearing these hoods, imported from Europe, imported from the religious festivals of Europe, pointed hoods with knives, okay? And these group called the Klan would make sure, through violence, that the blacks would not make any progress in society. So those three things, intimidation, discrimination, and segregation, were the three pillars of what we call the Jim Crow system.